It was a bright and sunny morning when David, a young tourist, arrived at the Grand Royal Palace. He had always dreamed of traveling to foreign places, and today his dream was finally coming true. David was full of energy and excitement, ready to explore the wonders of this historic palace. Little did he know, this trip would teach him a lesson he would never forget. The palace stood tall with its beautiful architecture, ancient walls, and massive gates. The gardens surrounding it were perfectly kept, and everything seemed to sparkle in the sunlight. David couldn't wait to take photos of everything, so he quickly pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures of the magnificent building. But David wasn't the type of tourist to simply admire the beauty around him. No, he was a tourist who loved to show off, making sure everyone around him knew just how important he was. As he walked through the grounds, he made sure to speak loudly, telling his friends about all the amazing places he had already visited in the past. He laughed and joked, not realizing that his behavior was starting to draw the attention of others. In the center of the garden stood a royal guard. Dressed in a red uniform, the guard stood completely still, like a statue, his eyes forward, paying no attention to the world around him. David had seen guards like this before in his travels, and he thought they were just part of the show. They were nothing more than decorations, right? It seemed harmless to him. David walked closer to the guard, still talking with his friends. His eyes sparkled with mischief. "Let's have some fun," he whispered to his friend. David spotted a nearby fountain, the water splashing in the air, and an idea popped into his head. He could splash the water towards the guard and see how he would react. After all, the guard wasn't real. He was just standing there, so why not have a little fun? Without thinking twice, David bent down and grabbed a handful of water from the fountain. With a quick flick of his wrist, he splashed the water high in the air. To his surprise, some of it landed on the royal guard's boots. He laughed loudly, pleased with himself. "Look at that. He didn't even move," David joked, turning to his friends. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had happened. The guard remained perfectly still, his face unreadable, as if he hadn't even noticed the water. The tourists nearby glanced over, but said nothing. But something in the air had shifted. David felt a strange tension, but he ignored it. He wasn't worried. After all, what could happen? The guard wasn't going to do anything, or was he? David's friends, who had been laughing along with him, suddenly grew quiet. A few of the other tourists began to stare, their eyes wide with surprise. Something was about to happen, but David didn't know what. He stood there, still feeling confident, unaware that in the next few moments, everything would change. David continued to smile, thinking his playful splash of water had been harmless. He watched as his friends laughed, clearly enjoying the moment. But as they all relaxed, something felt different. The atmosphere around him shifted slightly. The tourists who had been minding their own business suddenly grew quiet. It wasn't just the fact that they were looking at him, it was the way they looked at him. Their faces were a mix of surprise and concern. David didn't understand why. After all, he had done nothing wrong. Turning back to the guard, David noticed that he had not moved a muscle. The guard still stood completely still, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His calmness only made David feel even more confident. "Look at him. He doesn't even care," David said to his friend, raising his voice as if to make sure everyone could hear. "I bet he doesn't even blink. What a statue." His friends chuckled, but something about the scene didn't feel right. The tourists around them, who had been looking at David with wide eyes, slowly began to whisper among themselves. They probably had seen tourists do similar things before, but maybe this time was different. David, still confident in his actions, took another step closer to the guard. He thought he could push it a little further. "He must be bored," David muttered under his breath. "Let's see how long he can stand there without moving." Just then, a sound broke the silence. The soft but sharp sound of a boot scraping against the stone floor. David turned quickly, his eyes widening in surprise. The guard's posture had changed. For the first time, he shifted, taking a small step forward. The change was subtle, but to David, it was like a signal. The air seemed to thicken. It was like the guard had suddenly come to life. David stopped laughing. The guard had not spoken a word, yet his presence now seemed so much stronger. It was as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The crowd around them fell completely silent. David glanced at his friends, but they were no longer laughing. They looked nervous, unsure of what would happen next. He could feel his heart start to race a little. What had he done? The excitement he had felt earlier was quickly fading, replaced by a strange sense of unease. The guard's eyes never moved from their position, but David could feel the weight of the guard's gaze on him. It was the kind of stare that seemed to reach straight through him. David felt himself shift uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some of his earlier confidence, but it wasn't working. The guard's stance was so firm, so unwavering. It was as though he was not just standing still, but holding the weight of centuries of tradition behind him. David's smile faded as the situation began to sink in. He had crossed a line, but he didn't know how to undo it. He had underestimated the guard's role and the importance of respect in this foreign land. A nervous laugh escaped his lips, but it sounded hollow even to him. A moment passed, and then the guard took another step toward David. This time, David's friends stepped back a little. They could feel the tension in the air too. And it wasn't the fun kind of tension David had expected. It was something serious, something important. And David suddenly wished he hadn't made the splash in the first place. David took a small step back as the royal guard moved closer. It was almost as if the guard had become more alive, more real, and David couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. The guard's movements were slow, deliberate, and controlled. His boots clicked softly against the stone floor with each step, but his eyes never left David. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and the once laughing tourists now stood in an uncomfortable silence. Some shifted their weight nervously from foot to foot, while others watched the scene closely, waiting to see what would happen next. David's smile, which had been wide and carefree just moments ago, now seemed awkward and out of place. The guard's expression remained unreadable. His face was calm, but his posture had shifted. He stood even straighter, his shoulders squared, as if preparing for something. The stoic look on his face made David feel small, almost like a child who had been caught doing something wrong. David tried to laugh it off. "Hey, it's just water, right?" he said, attempting to downplay the situation. He glanced over at his friends, hoping they would join in the joke and ease the tension. But no one was laughing. In fact, his friends were looking at him with wide eyes, and one of them even whispered, "David, maybe you should apologize." David ignored the advice, his pride still strong. "Come on, it's not a big deal," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. The guard's silent presence was starting to get to him. The royal guard wasn't saying anything, but the way he moved closer made it clear that he was not amused. The quiet made everything seem worse. David wished the guard would just say something so he could know what to do next, but the silence was more powerful than any words. The crowd around them had grown even quieter, some stepping back slightly as if giving the two space. David could feel their eyes on him, and it made him uncomfortable. Why had he thought this was a good idea? A stupid move, that's what it was. But it was too late now. There was no going back. Finally, the guard stopped directly in front of David, standing tall, as if he were a mountain, unshakable. He looked down at David for a long moment. David's heart raced. The guard hadn't said a word yet, but his eyes were enough. It was a look that told David that something had been broken, something that couldn't be fixed with a laugh or a joke. David took a deep breath, his voice a little shakier now. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said, trying to soften his tone. "I was just messing around." But the guard still didn't speak. The silence between them felt endless. David shifted from foot to foot, feeling the weight of the moment grow heavier. The guard's eyes never left him, and David suddenly realized that he had done something much worse than he first thought. This wasn't just a silly prank. This was about respect. David glanced around at the other tourists again, but they were all watching, some shaking their heads. The reality of the situation was beginning to hit him hard. The guard wasn't just a soldier in a uniform. He was part of something much bigger, a tradition of respect that David had completely ignored. David swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer now. "I didn't mean to disrespect you." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but they were the only thing that made sense. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The guard remained silent for a few long seconds, staring down at David. His expression was still calm, but there was something in his eyes that made David feel even smaller. It was as if the guard wasn't just standing there. He was silently judging, evaluating, and waiting. Every moment of silence felt like an eternity. David swallowed hard, still standing there, his heart pounding. He felt like everyone in the crowd was watching him, waiting for what would happen next. His friends stood off to the side, looking uneasy, unsure whether they should step in or just stay quiet. David had never felt so uncomfortable in his life. Finally, the guard broke the silence. His voice was deep, steady, and filled with authority, but he still didn't raise it much. "You have shown disrespect," he said in a clear, even tone. David's stomach dropped. The weight of those words hit him hard. He had never expected this. A simple prank had turned into something much more serious. The guard's voice held a kind of power that David had never heard before. It wasn't just the words, it was how he said them. It was like the guard's words had a weight behind them, a weight that David couldn't ignore. I didn't mean to," David stammered, trying to explain himself. But his words sounded weak, almost like an excuse. He realized that no matter how much he tried to talk his way out of it, the situation was much bigger than a simple apology. The crowd around them had started to gather in a circle, their eyes glued to the scene. The quiet buzz of whispered conversations filled the air, but no one dared speak too loudly. The tension was thick, and David could feel the pressure growing heavier with every passing second. The guard stepped closer, his uniform making a soft rustling sound as he moved. David felt his body tense up. It wasn't just the guard's size or his stance. It was the way he carried himself. He wasn't just a man in uniform. He was someone who had spent years learning to be in control, to handle situations like this without any hint of hesitation. "I am not here to listen to excuses," the guard continued, his voice firm and unyielding. "You have disrespected not just me, but the tradition and honor that I stand for, and that is something that cannot be ignored." David's chest tightened. He had thought it was just a small act of fun, but now he realized how much deeper this ran. The guard wasn't just a person in a uniform. He was part of a long-standing tradition, something that David had never fully understood. His light-hearted prank was a direct challenge to that tradition. David glanced around at the tourists watching. They had stopped whispering. Everyone was now focused on the scene unfolding before them. Some people even seemed nervous, as if they feared what would happen next. David wished he could just disappear, but he knew it was too late for that. He had to face the consequences of his actions. The guard's eyes never left him. "You will follow me," the guard ordered. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the command. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His mind raced. What would happen now? Was he going to be thrown out of the palace? Was he in trouble with the authorities? His legs felt weak, but somehow he managed to take a step forward, unsure of where the guard was leading him. He couldn't believe how quickly things had gone from lighthearted to serious. What had started as a silly splash of water had turned into a confrontation that he would remember for the rest of his life. David followed the royal guard as he was led away from the garden, his mind racing. The crowd of tourists seemed to part as they walked through, some people whispering quietly, others staring at him with wide eyes. David felt the weight of their gazes on him, and it made him feel even more uncomfortable. He had thought the worst was over, but now, it seemed like things were only getting more serious. The royal guard led him to a small, quiet area behind the palace. It was a place where the tourists rarely went, and the air here felt different. It was cooler, quieter, and the walls were lined with tapestries that told stories of the past. Everything about this space seemed to speak of tradition, history, and respect. David felt small standing there, as if he didn't belong. The guard stopped and turned to face him. There was no anger in his expression, just a calm, unshakable sense of authority. "You may not understand," the guard began, his voice even and steady, "but what you did was not just disrespectful to me. It was a disrespect to everything that this place represents." David frowned, trying to make sense of what the guard was saying. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, feeling embarrassed now. "I thought it was just a joke. I didn't know it was such a big deal." The guard nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting David's response. "Many tourists come here and do not understand the importance of our traditions. They see the guards as statues or decorations. But we are not statues. We are part of a long and proud history, a history built on respect, discipline, and honor." David felt his stomach twist. He had not known about these traditions. To him, the guard had just been a person standing in place, part of the tourist experience. But now, hearing the guard's words, David realized he had crossed a line. He hadn't just splashed water on a person. He had insulted something far more important than he had ever imagined. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to disrespect your traditions. I didn't understand." The guard's eyes softened, just a little, as if he could see the sincerity in David's apology. "I understand that you did not know," he said, "but now you do. And you must learn that respect for tradition is not just for others to understand. It is for you to follow." David nodded, feeling ashamed. He had always thought that he was a respectful person, but now he saw how easy it was to overlook things when you didn't understand them. He had taken the guard for granted, assuming that he was just another figure in a uniform. He had never considered the deeper meaning behind the guard's role in the palace. For a few moments, there was only silence between them. David stood there, trying to absorb what the guard had said. It was a humbling moment, one that he would not forget. He felt like he had been given a lesson in respect, one that went far beyond just his actions. It was about understanding the value of others, their roles, and the history they carried with them. David looked up at the guard, his face serious now. "I'll make sure to be more careful," he promised. "I won't forget this." The guard gave him a small nod, acknowledging the apology, but his expression remained stern. "Good. Remember that respect is earned through actions, not words." David stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of the guard's words. He realized that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences, and from that moment on, he would always be more mindful of the people he met and the places he visited, understanding that every culture had its own rules and values, even if they were different from his own. David stood there, still absorbing the guard's words. The silence between them felt heavy, and he could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the guard's calm authority that had him feeling uneasy. It was the realization that he had made a serious mistake, a mistake that, at that moment, seemed impossible to undo. He glanced at the guard, but the man's expression remained stern and unyielding. David had been to many places before, acted out in many ways. But this felt different. This was a moment that would stay with him, one he couldn't simply laugh off or forget. "Please, I really didn't mean any harm," David said, his voice soft now, a sharp contrast to the confident tone he had used earlier. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "I wasn't thinking about tradition or anything. I just thought it was funny. But I see now that it wasn't." The guard didn't respond immediately. He continued to stand tall, his face a mask of calm. David wasn't sure whether the man was listening or just waiting for him to finish speaking. The longer the silence stretched, the more desperate David felt. He needed to fix this. He needed to make the guard understand that he wasn't a bad person, just someone who had made a careless mistake. "I'm sorry," David repeated, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't realize the significance. I didn't mean to disrespect you or anyone. I really didn't know." The guard still didn't speak. Instead, he stepped back a little, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on David. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to make David feel even more uncomfortable. The guard was showing no signs of letting him off the hook. David could feel the pressure of the moment building with every passing second. "I'll do anything to make up for it," David said, his desperation growing. "Please, just tell me what I can do. I don't want to get into trouble. I didn't mean to cause any harm, I swear." The guard's eyes remained steady, but for the first time, David thought he saw a slight shift in the man's expression. It was almost as if the guard was considering what David had said. The longer the silence continued, the more David felt like he was drowning in his own mistakes. His pride had disappeared, replaced with a feeling of complete humility. The crowd of tourists who had followed them seemed to be holding their breath as well. No one said a word, but David could feel their eyes on him, their judgment lingering in the air. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to take back what he had done, but he knew that wasn't possible. "I truly am sorry," David said again, almost pleading. "I promise I'll never disrespect anyone like this again. Please, don't punish me." The guard finally moved again. His eyes softened just a little, and for the first time, his voice seemed less stern. "You have apologized," he said, his tone still firm, but not as cold as before. "That is a start." David felt a small sigh of relief. He wasn't completely off the hook yet, but at least the guard wasn't as angry as he had seemed moments ago. David was beginning to realize that he didn't just need to apologize. He needed to show that he understood why his actions had been wrong. And that wasn't something he could do in a few words. It was something he would have to prove through his actions. "I won't forget this," David said, his voice steadying as he looked the guard in the eye. "I promise I'll do better." The guard gave a slight nod, then turned and began walking away. David stayed in place for a moment, letting everything sink in. He had been given a second chance, but he knew this lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the guard left, David watched him go, feeling both a sense of relief and deep gratitude. He had learned the hard way, but it had been a lesson that he wouldn't soon forget. From now on, he would never take tradition, respect, or authority for granted again. David stood still for a few moments after the guard had walked away. The quiet around him felt different now, more peaceful, but also filled with a deeper understanding. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, and he could still feel the tension in his chest. But there was also a sense of relief. The guard had let him off the hook, for now, but David knew that he had learned something important today. As he glanced around, David saw that the tourists who had been watching him earlier were now going back to their own activities. The crowd had begun to scatter, and things were slowly returning to normal. But David wasn't in the mood to explore the palace any longer. His earlier excitement had disappeared, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. He walked back toward the main part of the palace, his thoughts racing. The more he thought about the guard's words, the more he understood the gravity of what he had done. What had seemed like a harmless joke to him had been something much more significant to the people here. David had been so caught up in the idea of being a tourist that he had forgotten the importance of respecting the culture he was visiting. For the first time, David truly understood that the world wasn't just about having fun or doing what he wanted. It was also about understanding others, their customs, and the way they lived. It was about showing respect, not just for the people around him, but for the places and traditions that shaped them. David found a quiet spot in the garden, away from the tourists and the bustle of the palace. He sat down on a stone bench, staring at the beautiful flowers around him. His thoughts drifted back to the guard, the calm way he had spoken, the way he had stood tall and unshaken. David realized that it wasn't just the guard's uniform that made him powerful. It was his dignity, his pride, and the strength he carried with him. The guard didn't need to shout or get angry. He had shown his power through his calmness, his control, and his ability to stand firm in his beliefs. As David sat there, he began to feel a change within himself. He had never thought of himself as an arrogant person, but today had shown him that even the smallest actions could have big consequences. He realized that there were many things he didn't understand about the world, about cultures, and about how to truly show respect. It wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about how he carried himself, how he acted, and how he respected the people and traditions around him. David closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He made a promise to himself that he would be more mindful in the future. He would take the time to learn about the cultures he visited, to understand the traditions, and to treat every person he met with the respect they deserved. He knew that this was only the beginning of a deeper journey of understanding. After sitting there for a while, David stood up and took one last look at the palace. He still felt a bit uneasy, but he also felt something else, a sense of growth. He had learned a valuable lesson today, and he knew it would stay with him for the rest of his life. With a renewed sense of respect and humility, David walked away from the palace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he would approach the world differently now. He was ready to learn, to grow, and to never forget the importance of respect. As David walked away from the royal palace, the weight of the day began to lift, but the lesson he had learned stayed with him. He had come to this place expecting nothing more than to enjoy a fun trip, take some pictures, and maybe show off a little. But now he realized how wrong he had been. What had started as a careless joke had turned into an unforgettable moment of growth. The palace, with its grand architecture and beautiful gardens, was still impressive. But now it felt different to David. It wasn't just a tourist attraction. It was a place filled with history, culture, and traditions that had been passed down through generations. David had only scratched the surface of what this place meant to the people who cared for it, and he knew he had a lot to learn. As he strolled through the peaceful streets outside the palace, David found himself reflecting on the guard's words. He hadn't just apologized for splashing water on the man. He had apologized for failing to understand the bigger picture. The guard had shown him that respect wasn't just about being polite. It was about understanding the values and customs of others, especially when visiting their homes or places of importance. David's mind began to shift. He wasn't just a tourist anymore. He was someone who was beginning to understand the deeper connections between people, their cultures, and the respect they had for their history. It was a realization that filled him with both awe and humility. He thought about how often he had traveled before, always in a hurry, always thinking about the next photo or the next adventure. But now he wanted to take his time, to learn, to listen, and to really understand the places he visited. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the streets, David felt a sense of peace. The earlier tension had melted away, and in its place was a quiet sense of gratitude. He was grateful for the chance to experience something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was a lesson he would carry with him, not just in his travels, but in every part of his life. David realized that everyone he met had a story, a history, and something worth respecting. Whether they were a royal guard in a palace or a stranger on the street, everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. This new understanding filled David with a sense of responsibility, a responsibility to always approach others with an open mind and a willingness to learn. By the time David reached his hotel, the sky had turned dark, and the city around him was alive with lights and sounds. But he felt different. He didn't just feel like another tourist in a foreign place. He felt like someone who had truly experienced a part of it, someone who had learned to respect and appreciate the culture he was visiting. He took one last look at the city before heading inside. "I'll never forget this," he whispered to himself, knowing that this experience had changed him. David was ready for the next chapter of his travels, but this time, he would be different. He would be more thoughtful, more respectful, and more open to understanding the world and the people in it. And as he lay down to sleep that night, he felt a sense of peace knowing that he had grown, even if it had taken a mistake to get there. The next day, David woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent the evening thinking about everything he had learned. The guard's lesson, the way the palace had taught him about respect, and how he felt now. All of it had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had come to this foreign land hoping for adventure, but he had found something even more valuable, a deeper understanding of the world around him. As he got ready for the day, David thought about how he would approach the rest of his trip. He wasn't going to be the same tourist who wandered around, snapping pictures without truly appreciating the places he visited. He wanted to be more mindful, more respectful of the people and cultures that made each place unique. Today, he was determined to show that he had learned from his mistake. David headed out to explore the city once again. This time, he walked slowly, taking in the sights, the sounds, and the energy of the place. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way the local people greeted each other, the small details in the architecture, and the way traditions were woven into daily life. Each moment felt more meaningful now, and David felt like he was no longer just an outsider passing through. He was beginning to feel like he was a part of the city, at least in a small way. As he walked through the busy market, David found himself in a conversation with a local shopkeeper. They spoke about the city, the culture, and the things that mattered to the people who lived there. David asked questions, not just to learn, but because he was genuinely interested in the answers. He listened carefully, taking in the history and stories that the shopkeeper shared. It was a different kind of conversation from the ones he usually had as a tourist, and David realized how much he had been missing by simply rushing through his travels without truly engaging. Later that afternoon, David returned to the palace, this time with a different perspective. He walked around the gardens again, but this time, he took the time to read the plaques that told the history of the place. He didn't rush to get to the next spot for a photo or a quick look. Instead, he allowed himself to truly appreciate the beauty and significance of the palace. The guard he had spoken to the day before was still there, standing tall in his uniform. But today, David didn't see him as just a part of the scenery. He saw him as a symbol of something much bigger, a representation of the traditions and values that made this place so special. David approached the guard, this time with respect in his heart. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a nod of acknowledgement. The guard nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face. It was as if he knew that David had learned his lesson. There was no need for words between them now. As the day came to a close, David felt a sense of peace. He had learned so much in such a short time, and he knew this experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. He didn't just see the world differently now. He understood it better. The journey was far from over. David had many more places to visit, many more lessons to learn. But he knew that he would approach the rest of his travels with a new attitude, one of respect, curiosity, and a desire to truly connect with the world around him. With a final glance at the palace, David smiled. This trip had started with a mistake, but it had turned into something much greater. And as he walked away, he knew that every step from here on out would be guided by the lessons he had learned, lessons that would stay with him long after his travels were over.